What's up, everybody? It's Dr. Keegan here with our video for week 5 of Gender and Pop Culture. Before I get started with discussing the content for this week, I want to give you some sort of close to midterm reminders. We've been working through some early theoretical training in how to conduct cultural studies analysis, but we are completing those first two units, foundations and analyzing gender, sexuality, and race in popular culture. We're at the end of those units. So what that means is that we're moving into an area of the course where we're going to be looking at shared primary texts. So the reading is going to shift from just secondary analysis to looking at actual pop culture texts together without a lot of guidance, right? Doing some of our own interpretive work. So there are 5 main primary texts in this course. You will be picking one of them to write your final paper or project on. So it's really important that you get a hold of these primary texts and that you have them and engage them because you're doing a lot of pre-work on them um, during the bulk of the semester. So the first shared primary text that you're going to need for next week, really quickly, actually, coming up on, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you're going to be reading this, is a comic book called Bitch Planet. And I've assigned just volume 1, which is called Extraordinary Machine. I think it collects like the first 5 issues of Bitch Planet. Um, there are instructions on the syllabus about how to get this book. I ordered some for the library. It's also available for like $9 online. It's not expensive. Comics are a low form of media. They're usually pretty cheap. But yeah, we're going to be reading this as a group. So if you don't have it yet, now is the time to figure out where to get it and get it in your hands so that you don't fall behind. Right after that, really quickly, we're going to be starting to play a video game together called Gone Home. This is also linked on the syllabus where to get it. You do not need a game system to play Gone Home. You can download it onto a laptop or even a phone. I would not recommend phone, but it's possible. So if you haven't gotten Gone Home onto a system or your laptop, home desktop yet, do so. This can be a little more difficult to figure out how to make work. So I'm anticipating some people might run into issues with this. Please get started now, finding a way to get it onto a system that you can use. Okay. And if you run into problems, particularly with Gone Home, email me because we can troubleshoot that together. Okay. So just a warning, we have some main text coming up that you really do need to have access to, where they won't be provided by me. Okay. Cool. Let's get started. So we are ending Unit 2, Analyzing Gender, Sexuality, and Race, by thinking about queer analysis of pop culture. We've talked about feminist analysis. We've done some work with sort of critical race analysis with hooks and the oppositional gaze. And we're building out our idea of looking and gazing and interpretive work by adding queer analysis. Um, so I had you read a piece by Alex Doty, who is a really famous queer cultural studies academic who unfortunately died in a terrible car accident a few years ago. He was only at mid-career. But his work is incredibly important for linking queer theory to cultural studies. And I had you read a really important chapter of his book, Making Things Perfectly Queer, called There's Something Queer Here. And you'll notice that he references the people we've already read. He references Hooks. He refers to Mulvey and feminist film analysis, right? So these people were all writing in conversation with one another or across the bulk of maybe 2 decades. They also cite Stuart Hall, who we've talked about, right? So you can see a field in formation, and you can see how the field reaches these points where new modes of analysis get invented because there are entire subject positions that aren't being considered by the field, like Black women or like queer folks, right? So that's to say that this reading maybe was harder for you than the others because it's coming from a less considered point of reception, which is, you know, sort of like people who fall outside the dominant understandings of sex and gender, right? LGBTQ people, particularly. So I'm going to have you play a bit with these ideas in the discussion group, but I want to unpack the reading a little bit for you before I have you do that work. And I'll get back to the Golden Girls and why they're here. Okay, so reading queerly. I had you read a piece by Alex Doty called There's Something Queer Here. Really, this is another opening kind of argument that Doty is making, similar to Mulvey and Hooks, that there needs to be another mode of interpretive theorization for this idea of queer reception of media texts or pop culture texts. So in the piece, Doty is making a case for queer reception. Reception meaning the process of consuming and making sense of a piece of culture, right? Particularly visual media. This term gets used for, but we could generalize that to just the process of our senses engaging with a cultural text. So he's saying, hey, queer reception needs to be accounted for because there's this entire history of queer people engaging media or culture that doesn't seem to represent anything queer at all. And yet there has been this cultural work done to form interpretive relationships to dominant culture that we could say queers those texts or opens them up to LGBTQ positionalities. So you'll notice the bulk of what we think of as sort of like stereotypical gay culture, like musicals, Judy Garland, Madonna, right? None of that has gay stuff in it, really. So what is it about those texts that made them so interesting to gay people, to queer people? Doty is interested in why or how queer viewers or consumers find their way into texts that seem to rebuff or not contain LGBTQ identification. Does that make sense? I hope so. So Doty is interested in a more capacious application of queer. He wants queer to be something that's available to almost anybody to do as a reading style. He says, rather than limit queer culture to texts only containing LGBTQ representation, which would be a very limited number, he's writing in the early 90s, which there was almost no mainstream culture that contained LGBTQ representation, right? He says, rather than only going and looking for those representations of identities, he wants to open this idea of queerness up to consider how any text can be queer. Any text can reveal resistant aspects, right? Can resist sex and gender normativity if we look. Normativity is never total. It's always attempting to be total, but failing. There are always gaps in the system. So you can see, similar to Hooks, this is a resistant type of reading that looks for misalignments, gaps, suppressed modes of desire, failures to construct dominant meaning, right? As points where queer people can find pleasure in the sort of failure of dominant codes of sex and gender. So rather than limiting the queer gaze or queer reading to just gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people who have these identities, Doty wants to consider a queer reading as something anybody can do. And that's because sex and gender norms oppress everybody, right? Like, sure, LGBT people belong to groups that have been historically stigmatized in specific ways, but there's the larger consideration of the sex and gender system itself controlling the behavior of everybody, right? And so Doty's trying to make the case for like straight people or cisgender people could actually find pleasure in being released from those norms, similarly to how LGBTQ people resist them, right? So he's trying to build a more universal idea of what queerness is and why even straight and cis people might be interested in finding these gaps. He says that, queer people have had to learn how to do this because queer people are raised inside of straight culture and need to find the gaps and find the ways to discover their identities and build queer relationships. But that doesn't mean that straight people can't learn to read those codes as well, right? So this is the broader sense of queer as a mode, an interpretive mode versus just belonging to a fixed group of people. So why queer? What does it bring to the table as a mode of analysis for culture, right? That's something that Doty is making an argument about here. Um, he wants to take this concept of queer from a body of theory known as queer theory, which is another course we offer at GBSU that if you find this course interesting, would highly suggest you sign up for. I'm offering it next semester, and we do a lot of media analysis in that course. We watch a lot of movies. We watch Finding Nemo. We watch The Matrix. We watch Rocky Horror Picture Show. But so if you're interested, follow me there. It's got open seats. However, that's a body of critical theory that's really interested in the production of sexuality and gender norms, right? And he's trying to take this idea of queerness as being in resistance to norms and bringing it over into the field we're reading in, cultural studies and media studies, right? For a couple of different reasons that he explains. One, he says that queer, as it's being used over in queer theory, is a wider and more flexible term than just gay, right? And that it's more useful than gay because it helps us think outside of gender categories itself. Remember, gay as an idea still really relies on gender categories. It still wants to have this idea of same gender or same sex attraction, which is really rooted in gender being very legible and predictable. And if we're interested in destabilizing gender and gender norms, we might need a different way into querying right, gender than gay or lesbian modes of reading, which really stabilize gender, even as they destabilize heteronormativity. So again, thinking intersectionally here is useful. I need some water. He also says that queer is more inclusive. It helps us gather up a huge range of what we could call non-straight ways of making meaning. And we can also think outside of just identity categories with queer. Queer doesn't refer to any single identity. It's more rooted in actions that resist gender and sex normativity, right? Even straight people do queer things now and then, right? Halloween's coming up. That's a holiday when a lot of straight people are allowed to be sort of queer for a day, to queer their genders up, to play roles, to get outside of the boxes that we're expected to live in, right? So I encourage you to think of non-straightness as a set of actions that anyone can take, and queer being a way of talking about that. Also, there's this problem of lesbian and gay identities being really dominant modes of reading sex and gender diversity. But there are other types of identities, right, that get kind of crowded out by LNG often. And so queer is a way of saying, okay, we're going to maybe displace lesbian and gay identities from being in the center so that we can think about bi-ness, pan-ness, transness, agenderedness, asexualness, right? Or asexuality as other modes of queer that aren't identical with gay and lesbian identification. Okay? And now this is really where Doty's politics start to show, because he's very influenced by this wave of queer activism in the 80s through early 90s that was in resistance to the AIDS crisis, right? And was very militant and demanding things of the government, and was saying, hey, gay people, wake up. Mainstream politics is not going to save your life. We need a different political sensibility, which is how queer was being used at the time to name this more resistant, militant, demanding politics that was being invented, right? So queer also marks this more resistant stance to normativity and assimilation than the older terms of gay and lesbian that were being also used at that time. So that's part of what he's arguing for here, like why queer is important to him to bring into cultural studies. Also, right, note that he's offering this entire archive of pop culture texts that he says are queer, but have no narratively LGBT content, right? He wants to broaden the archive of media and culture available to queer reading beyond just there's a gay character in this show or this movie, or there's a gay kiss in this sitcom episode, right? He's saying no, queerness needs to be bigger than that to account for all the ways that queer people have built relationships with texts. He spends a long time talking about it. He even mentions Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which we've already watched a number from, right? As a text that has no visible gay content. And yet, as a young man, he really identified with because of the way in which the text opened itself up to his identification with Marilyn Monroe, right? Um, his fantasy of maybe being her and having all those guys around him wanting to be his partner, right? There's a way in which that text really offered pleasure to a gay male viewer, even though it had no identifiable gay content, right? So what Doty means is that these texts that he says are open to queer readings, they offer gaps in straight and cisgender meaning. It's not that they have LGBT identities just here for you to consume in a one-to-one relationship. What they demonstrate is that heteronormativity and cisnormativity as systems aren't in complete control of sex and gender, that other possibilities are available, right? Um, and that experience of those gaps and breakdowns in those norms can be highly pleasurable for LGBT people, but also for straight and cis people who also are oppressed by gender norms, right? So Doty's looking for texts that offer that kind of surprise pleasure when things don't quite line up the way they're supposed to. He says that these modes of reading queerly, right, are useful because they demonstrate the constructedness of sex and gender systems themselves, right? Um, so a text that sort of shows how constructed the relationships of heteronormativity are, how phony they are, can be really pleasurable to queer people as well as straight people. It gives us relief from the naturalization of them. Think about Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, which we've been studying for all of the semester. It's really rich as a text. Doesn't that text demonstrate the constructedness of heterosexuality and gender relations, that they are made up and therefore exploitable, right? Wouldn't that also suggest that they could be resisted? Wouldn't that be interesting to say feminists, but also lesbians? Also, maybe straight people who are disenchanted with the sexual expectations of the 1950s. You can see why that film would be popular with lots of viewers, right? Um, so it's not just that we're looking for LGBT identity. We are looking for texts that illustrate the artificiality of the entire sex and gender system itself. So he says both LGBT and straight cis modes of identification, right, rely on that dominant system, while queer modes look for where it fails. So let me stress this again. LGBT identities show up as different from straight and cis identities because of their relationship to the dominant sex and gender system, right? They mix around the categorizations of binary sex and gender in ways that show up as different, but that ultimately still depend on those categories. And so Doty is like, what about a mode of reading that looks for when those categories fall apart, right? Maybe that would be more transformative. So what can we do with queer reading? I started out the semester talking about hegemony, right? Which is a process of negotiation by which dominant groups win the consent of oppressed groups who then don't, revolt and tear down the system, but live within it, right? Um, Queer as a mode of reading helps us notice how that hegemony is working all the time and how it's never actually a system of total control. There are always gaps, contradictions, slippages that we can notice in ideology, right? In the dominant mode of operating as if sex and gender are just these totally naturalized systems that only work in these specific ways. We know that's not true, but we have to keep reminding ourselves that it's not true. And Doty says queer reading is a way of noticing and re-noticing that that system isn't total. It doesn't explain everything. It also helps us notice that LGBT identity positions are not inherently resistant. Okay. We are living in a time when gay and lesbian identities have gotten pretty normalized, especially white gender conforming cisgender gay and lesbian identities. Think of your Neil Patrick Harris's or your Ellen DeGeneres's, right? We're living in a time when there's nothing particularly politically radical those people are doing. Gay and lesbian have, through a lot of kind of conscious political choices, moved themselves quite close to the center of the culture in many ways. And those identities can very much be used to support dominant values of white supremacy, capitalism, consumerism. And so again, as that process continually takes place, queer reading helps us notice, hey, where is the actual resistant energy here? It's not necessarily attached to LGBT automatically, right? So he says queer often operates within the non-queer, right? There are moments where straightness can be very queer. There's a lot of bro relationships that are queer without being gay. If you look at Jane Ward's work, for instance, right? A lot of straight identified men who are doing pretty queer things with each other. It's pretty routine. And then there's a lot of non-queer within the queer, right? There's a lot of almost straight seeming gay people, right? So we need ways to account for those things. And identity categories don't always help us track those complexities. Also, this idea of queer helps us see how normative identities like straightness rely on the suppressed presence of queerness. That in order for straight to be straight, it has to actively go out and push away and erase and close down queer possibility. And by doing that, it admits that queerness is there. Okay? So straightness cannot exist without queerness as a threat and a suppressed possibility that has to be there but denied. And again, if you've done any work reading sort of like 90s gender theory, like Judith Butler particularly, this is one of her main arguments about straightness, that it actually requires queerness. And it's something that we get into much deeper analysis of in queer theory. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to check that class out. So, right, he says queer erotics are already part of the culture's erotic center. It's not that we have to go to the margins to find queerness, because it's going to be right next to straightness, because straightness requires it to draw a line and say, I will do this, but I won't do that, right? And that the queerness is right there as something to be turned away from. So how do we then turn toward it with queer reading? How do we notice when that's happening? So I told you I'd get back to the Golden Girls. But, I think Doty's analysis helps us understand why there's so much queer love for texts that are seemingly not queer, right? You might notice there's like really huge fandom, even among millennials, gay millennials, for this sitcom. And you could ask yourself, like, why on earth do gay people, men and women, trans people alike, love this show? It doesn't have to do with the identities of the characters or even really the romantic relationships or sexualities portrayed on the show. I would argue, and you could argue differently, that it has a lot to do with this fantasy of living outside the nuclear family. That here is an example of how to grow old, hang out with your friends in this sort of homosocial environment, get all this support, and never have to say goodbye to each other, right? Thank you for being a friend. Travel down the road and back again is the theme song, right? Your heart is true. You're a pal and a confidant. This is a show about friendship, where the relationships don't get broken up by people getting married off to male partners, or children don't get in the way of intimacy between friends. It's kind of the relationships queer people would love to have that get denied by dominant family structures, that get placed in secondary status. Here, they get to be the center. And these women get to live out this kind of queer fantasy of growing old with your most trusted friends in a world where the nuclear family doesn't intervene or interfere, right? Doesn't that sound awesome? Doesn't that sound like something queer people want and struggle to make happen in a world controlled by straight relationality? You know, a lot of queer people end up in senior living centers that are completely oppressive to queer identities, that make no space for queer people. So why would something like the Golden Girls offer a very pleasurable fantasy of maybe that not happening, right? Okay, so you can start to think about why, even though there's no gay people on the show, there's no queer relationships or queer sex on the show, really. It's touched on as a social issue, but it's not in the center of the frame. Nonetheless, queer people really love this program because of what it offers in terms of showing how that dominant system of the nuclear family, the biological nuclear family, showing what's right, what could be right off to the side of it as a possibility for living into your old age, right? So, what I mean to say when we talk about queer reading is that queer reading is a way of reinterpreting a textual world to emphasize suppressed contradictions, potentials, and pleasures, right? The biological nuclear family as a set of expectations suppresses the possibility of what Golden Girls represents. And I want you to understand that's why queer people like it, because it's something that is blocked from access in the dominant system. So queer reading means making a new world out of the world as it's represented to us, looking for those gaps and meaning, those contradictions, those suppressed possibilities, and building a different value system for their consumption through gay fandom, right? Queer fan communities that have built up these sort of adoring audiences around certain texts that offer these kinds of suppressed possibilities. Of course, no text can be purely queer because no text is purely normative either. So normativity constructs non-normativity, and I want you to remember that. And non-normativity constructs normativity. So these things are always kind of locked in a sort of dialectical mutual constitution with one another. We're really used to reading for dominant norms. It was really obvious to me in your work that you were great at finding the male gaze. However, what about non-normativity, right? What about over here, the thing that makes the norm through its suppression, exemption, marginalization, right? It's a lot harder to read for that stuff. So we're working on that in last week and this week, right? So what I'd like you to do, I'm actually gonna have you practice this a bit. Remember, we have this archive of text that Doty offers as open to queer reading. But again, he publishes this book in 1993. So that's pretty old by now, right? We now live in a very different media environment where there are a lot of artifacts, like gay and lesbian artifacts in our media. So it might be even harder for us to do this work because we have to think a little bit more creatively about the differences between queer reading and LGBT representation. Okay. So I'd like to figure out if we can help add to Doty's archive. So what I'd like you to do is think a bit about this lecture, look at the reading again, think about my example of the Golden Girls, right? And I'd like you to provide an example of a text. This can be television, film, music video, song, pop culture, right? Anything from pop culture, an ad even, right? That you think is open to a queer reading, even though it contains no obvious LGBTQ identities. Okay? I'm asking you to separate those things. Queerness, queer reading can be happening without LGBTQ representation. Okay? In your once you get your example, remember to screen grab, link it, whatever. I would like you to discuss how why you can read the text clearly, and I would like you to use at least one reference to Dodie's essay to support what you're saying. Okay. Um, and remember, you're looking for gaps in dominant sex and gender codes. And I'd like you to pay attention to formal and aesthetic details in your reading. So color, staging, editing, and like any formal aspects of the text that you think add to its queerness. I think you should include those as evidence for what you're saying about it. Okay. So I will put this prompt up over in the Blackboard window as well, so you can refer to it. And I'll also link these slides with the video so you can refer to them as well. Okay. I'm looking forward to see what you come up with here. And don't forget, next week, Bitch Planet, you're going to need to be reading that kind of beginning Monday. So make sure you've got that around, and also make sure you have a plan for accessing Gone Home and playing it. All right. Okay.